You're watching Reality Check. It's been 48 hours since the Taliban has seized power by the barrel of the gun in Afghanistan. 48 hours in which the Taliban has attempted to suggest it is no longer the dreaded near-medieval terror outfit of old. Is this makeover genuine or propaganda? The jury is still out. But consider this. A Taliban official, reportedly part of their cultural wing, was interviewed on state TV where he encouraged women to join the government and also offered an amnesty to all government workers.
باور است که زنان بزرگترین قربانی بحران‌ها و معضل‌ها در 40 چند ساله گذشته افغانستان بودند و امارت اسلامی نمی‌خواهد که پس از این باز هم زنان همچنان قربانی باشند.
Another video tweeted out by the Taliban on social media. It shows a Taliban official at a hospital in Kabul asking women doctors to carry on working.
څومره ډاکټران چې د کابل په شفاخانو کې دي نو ټول نه موږ غوښتنه کوو چې خپل وظیفو ته دې په اطمینان باندې راسي داسې اطمینان.
A Taliban member allowed himself to be interviewed by a woman anchor on Afghanistan's main news channel, Tolo News.
دغه څرګندونې څنګه ارزوي اوس مهال؟
کله دې چې تاسو پوښتنې ته ځواب ورکړم غواړم د دې اوسني وضعیت په اړه خپل ګران ولس ته مبارکي ووایم د دې مثبت تحول په نتیجه کې.
Tolo News tweeted this out. Video of its women journalists out reporting on the streets of Kabul. Ironically enough, on how despite the assurances by the Taliban that they're a changed entity, there are fewer women on the streets of Kabul because of their memories of earlier Taliban rule.
طالبان وایي چې ښځې دې راشي تګ راتګ دې وکړي په کابل ښار کې هېڅ ورته مشکل نشته او ستونزه نشته. دا یې طالبانو تر دې وړاندې ویلي دي. خو میرمنې وایي چې هغه کومه تجربه چې هغوی د طالبانو له پخوانۍ دورې نه لري.
Another Twitter video shows women protesting on the streets of Kabul asking for greater rights in the presence of armed Taliban fighters. Now, all this apart, social media is flooded with reports that things may not have changed that much, of how Taliban members and fighters are going door to door, singling out those considered problematic, like journalists or those seen as allied to the previous regime. Now, arguably in response to this, the Taliban spokesperson Sohail Shaheen tweeted out a number of tweets saying the Mujahideen cannot enter homes without permission and that no one's property or lives are at risk. He also assured diplomats and embassies of security. Now, this on a day when American President Joe Biden addressed the massive blowback he's facing for the chaotic consequences of America's botched pullout from Afghanistan in a speech where he began by saying the buck stops with him, but then went on seemingly to pass the buck on to everyone else, from the Afghan regime to the Afghan allies of America who've been left behind.
Our mission in Afghanistan was never supposed to have been nation building. Our only vital national interest in Afghanistan remains today what it has always been, preventing a terrorist attack on America's homeland. I inherited a deal that President Trump negotiated with the Taliban. Why I opposed the surge when it was proposed in 2009 when I was vice president. Afghanistan political leaders gave up and fled the country. The Afghan military collapsed, sometime without trying to fight. We talked extensively about the need for Afghan leaders to unite politically. They failed to do any of that. I also urged them to engage in diplomacy. This advice was flatly refused. I know there are concerns about why we did not begin evacuating Afghan civilians sooner. Some of the Afghans did not want to leave earlier. The Afghan government and its supporters discouraged us from organizing a mass exodus. I am President of the United States of America, and the buck stops with me.
All right, joining me tonight, I have with us Azmat Khan. She's an award-winning investigative journalist, a New York Times Magazine contributing writer, is joining us from New York. General VP Malik, former Chief of Army Staff, is on the show with us, as is Ajay Shukla, a former colleague, a defense analyst. Great to have him on as always. Thank you all so much for joining us. Azmat Khan, let me just start by asking you, there's so much to talk to you about, but let me just start by asking you first about your responses to the Biden speech, because I know you've been amongst the many voices who've been pointing out the huge crisis that a number of those who worked with America, its allies in Afghanistan, who've been left behind, and then you hear Joe Biden almost suggesting that it's kind of their fault.
Right. So a fundamental problem with what President Biden said was that he framed his speech around the decision to end the war, not around the hasty and chaotic exit that has left so many people who partnered themselves with the Americans in limbo. Another flaw was the fact that he did blame the Afghan government for many of these problems. And while it may be fair to critique certain politicians and political leaders, the reality is that Afghan national security forces have suffered immense human losses throughout this war. Now, they, while suffering those losses, were getting U.S. air support. So massive bombings accompanied these soldiers on the ground to help protect them. And even then, they were dying at high rates. So now, imagine that you take that air power out of the equation. The only thing that was really keeping this very tenuous government intact, you take away that air power and you expect forces to keep fighting when they were already losing so many lives with the support of American air power. It just doesn't add up to blame the Afghan government. At the same time, that air power was also having massive civilian tolls in battlefield provinces, lending support to the Taliban, and even among civilians just wanting them to strike whatever deal to make the war stop. So it doesn't really add up to blame Afghan national security forces in this situation.
I actually want to pull up your tweets about what you just said, because you put out a series of tweets which in a sense address that question about why the Afghan army and in that sense even the general populace just seemed to cave in and allowed the easy advance of the Taliban. Which, as you said, is linked to the fact that so much of the American bombing actually hit Afghan civilian population, particularly rural populations, very hard.
Yes. Nearly 3/4 of Afghanistan's population is in the rural countryside, in these rural areas. Now, they have been decimated by bombing. Even though the world's attention has turned away from the bombing that has been happening in Afghanistan, in 2019, the United States dropped more bombs in the country than in any previous year of this now 20-year-long war. So they were heavily bombing the countryside. And the intelligence, as we now know from the lack of intelligence in the lead up to the Taliban's takeover, was quite poor. So tons of civilians were dying. In families that I've spoken to, they've lost anywhere between 4 to 12 to 18 members in single incidents. And it's not just bombings, it's night raids by US-backed forces. It's also the Taliban, right? They're getting these kinds of attacks from all sides, and it's left people war-weary. We tend to, when we talk about Afghan women and girls, understandably, we're thinking about the tolls on women and girls in Kabul who are now going to get left behind, whose promises will be broken. But we don't necessarily talk as much about women and girls in the Afghan countryside, women and girls who just want to live a life free of war, not have their children die in their arms. You know, babies suffer disproportionate losses in bombings. Their bodies are smaller. They die more easily. And so imagine all of the mothers who've had to bury their children, women whom we never get to hear from.
Sure. So in a sense then, Azmat, you're addressing this almost mythology of the fact that there was this immense amount of support for the American presence and in a sense for the regime that they were propping up, while the ground reality is different. But now that the Taliban are here, that's the question which I guess everyone's struggling to answer, that this new kind of supposedly moderate Taliban, everything that we just played earlier, how much of that is convincing to you, or how much of it is just sort of propaganda for them to gain legitimacy?
I can't predict the future, but we can look to the past, and we can look at the past examples of times in which they've broken promises. We can perhaps learn lessons from, or they perhaps learned some lessons from the fact that a lack of international legitimacy is what led to the last campaign. So we're certainly, I think, going to see them make these kind of overtures that we've been seeing them make. For example, sending Taliban leaders to go mourn with Shias during Muharram, sitting for interviews with Afghan women journalists at this moment when international attention is focused on them. But the second that this fleeting media attention goes away, that the international community is not paying close attention, we may see something very different. And I wonder what leverage anyone has in order to get them to change those positions.
Okay. Let me just take that to Ajay and General VP Malik. General Malik, so much to unpackage, but let's just start with this kind of supposedly made over Taliban, which is talking about women's rights and which is talking about amnesty to government servants, that we won't do revenge attacks. Do you buy it?
For the time being, I think we'll have to just wait and watch. What they are saying is apparently quite different to Taliban 1.0. This is now we are talking of Taliban 2.0. And over the years, they may have also learned diplomacy, as we can make out, along with the military power that they have acquired. So I think it would be better to wait and watch for a few days, and yet also be ready in case of the adverse circumstances that appear either within Afghanistan or across Pakistan to India. So I think we have to be ready for both. And at the moment, I would suggest that we should wait and watch.
Okay. Ajay, your thoughts on Taliban 2.0?
Well, Taliban 2.0, first of all, I think let's come down to looking at the difference between the Taliban and the average Afghanistan rural area population. The difference is not huge. A lot of the very conservative views that the Taliban sort of mouths from time to time, fundamentalist views in many cases, are also held in belief by the Afghan people who live in the rural countryside. The Taliban, of course, overdid it completely by public whippings and executions and so on, and that they are very much in a position to change. They would have been adequately briefed by their handlers, and they would know that you can go thus far and no further when it comes to things like women's rights and sort of women's working and so on. So I think that you will see a Taliban 2.0 that is more moderate, more friendly in its appearance and the way it presents itself. And I don't think that provided they tone down what they were doing the last time, that they will encounter a great deal of opposition from the rural Afghans.
Right. In fact, at the moment, they have virtually no opposition at all in terms of any kind of armed resistance, unlike last time where there was this northern alliance in the northern part of the country. But Asmat, I just want to go back to where we started with Biden's speech, and also in particular in reference to all those Afghans who worked with America. Now, the Taliban might be trying to say, listen, we're not out to settle scores, but that population, that pool of people is quite vulnerable. Give us a sense of, how many people are still stranded, what's happening with them. You and others are working to get them out. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so there have only been 2,000 of these, SIV applicants, which are, translators who worked with the U.S. military, allowed into the United States, have come through this process. Actually, tens of thousands of them are still waiting. Their applications have been languishing. And now it's a little bit harder even because there's no embassy to coordinate all of this. Now, putting aside those individuals who worked with the U.S. military, there are a number of journalists and translators who worked with American news organizations. And the Biden administration very hastily rolled out these this program through which they could apply for refugee status, but the program is really flawed, right? They have to be in a third-party country for their application to get processed. So they have to get to Pakistan or India or Turkey first, and people are really struggling. Many people whom I've worked with, I've worked really hard to put in their applications through this program. The applications have to come from the highest U.S. employee at the news organization. So basically it would be, the CEO of the news organization would have to submit this package attesting to this person. But once that package is submitted, it's not like it just gets processed. That person has to make their way to a country with the U.S. embassy for that processing to start, and it could take anywhere between 12 and 14 months. And all of these people whom I'm talking to right now cannot get on flights. I mean, we've seen the images at the Kabul International Airport, and I'm in all of these different groups coordinating with people, trying to get people on flights, people I've worked with, young women journalists. And it's really tragic because everyone is so scared right now. The Taliban may be making these overtures to make people feel more comfortable, but given the reality and what so many of these people know, they don't just trust that.
Right. But General Malik, when we're talking about the fact that there is this situation now where the Taliban doesn't face any resistance, this bizarre kind of collapse of the Afghan army, what do you make of it as a soldier and a general? Billions of dollars pumped in by America, on paper at least, a strength at least 3 times more than the Taliban, and yet they just melted away.
I have to say that it is not easy to build and maintain effective and strong armed forces, particularly in multi-ethnic societies. And it is not difficult to destroy them if you do not choose the right leaders and you do not follow the HR policies. Now, this is exactly what has happened. Firstly, the collapse of the political authority and the way Ashraf Ghani and his colleagues ran away from the scene, that just goes to show what kind of political leadership was there. And that was followed by the leadership in the armed forces, both the Army and the Air Force. And the selection of people at the top in the Army and the Air Force has been more on account of ethnic association and nepotism, corruption, all those things. And apparently there was a major divide between them and the foot soldiers.
Right.
I'm told that the foot soldiers were not even getting pay for many months, or they were getting half pay for many months. So with this kind of leadership that you had, and the kind of policies that were being followed within the armed forces, apart from the political side, you can expect nothing but collapse. And this is exactly what happened.
Right.
They all ran away, and the soldiers were left probably selling their arms and as well as selling their loyalty to the Taliban. And that I won't be surprised at all.
Right. In fact, there's a whole lot of theorizing on how many of these deals could have been struck much earlier, from the time when the Americans announced their withdrawal, and then there were already deals being struck between the Taliban and various warlords and commanders and militia. But Ajay,
I must tell you that even earlier days in the late 90s,
yes, General,
a lot of warlords, this is how they just gave up and gave in to the Taliban at that time, except of course Masood, the Tajik leader. But others, we saw even General Dostum and so many else, they were only exchanging gifts with each other and giving away their loyalty at that time also.
Last quick comments. First from you, Ajay. We've seen Amrullah Saleh, who is the ex-vice president, still tweeting saying, I'm still president. Officially, I'm holed up possibly in the Panjshir Valley, which is a kind of anti-Taliban redoubt, most likely with Ahmad Shah Massoud's son, and I'm going to raise a force and fight them. Is this wishful thinking?
There are sort of serious difficulties that will be faced by somebody who at this stage decides to take on the Taliban. In the Afghan way of war and of consolidating power, you don't go in for, bloody battles and so on over there. a lot of these sort of acknowledgements of who the power is, who the big dog is in an area, are done through negotiations and through payoffs.
Sure.
Right now the Taliban has clearly, if you saw the video footage of its advance, each time it would enter a city, you could barely hear a shot fired because the defenders of that city had already vacated and gone home.
Okay.
Given all of this,
it's not going to be easy. Right.
It's going to be easy to build up an anti-Taliban force. Yes, there is this whole tradition within the Pancheri groups to resist the Taliban, but whether that is still alive today is something we'll have to see.
All right, okay, we're completely out of time. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you all so much for joining us. You've been a great panel. But before we go, let's leave you with the video of how the Indian Air Force managed to bring the Indian ambassador and the entire staff of the Indian mission in Kabul out of Taliban-controlled Afghanistan.
Well, the Indian Air Force was able to evacuate approximately 140 members of the Indian embassy, their security personnel and stranded journalists from Kabul this morning. Now, there were cheers and claps as the C-17 transport took off. It was a complicated process. Now, NDTV has learned that Taliban soldiers actually escorted the Indian contingent from the embassy to the airport and then onto this aircraft. In a tweet, the Foreign Minister Dr. Jaishankar said, movement of the Indian ambassador and the embassy staff from Kabul to India was a difficult and complicated exercise. Thank all those who cooperated and made and facilitated to make this possible. Back home in India, there was an overwhelming sense of relief. The jet landed first in Jamnagar, as you can see. Ambassador Rudrendra Tandon thanking the Indian Air Force. But getting out of Kabul was a nightmare. It all began a couple of days back. 2 Indian Air Force C-17 transports flew on that day for the evacuation mission to Kabul International Airport that you see. The security situation overnight between the 15th of August and the 16th of August deteriorated sharply. No evacuations were then possible. The Indian embassy was under observation by the Taliban. The high security green zone, which houses lots of embassies, had been breached. Overnight between the 15th and the 16th, Taliban soldiers raided what you see here, the Shahir Visa Agency, which processes visas for Afghans looking to travel to India. Now, the first batch of 45 Indian personnel who did evacuate yesterday. They were initially stopped by Taliban sentries en route to the airport. Personal belongings of a few Indian staff members were taken away by the Taliban thugs as they proceeded to the airport. The first Indian Air Force C-17 transport, which departed yesterday, took off in these very challenging circumstances. You can look at people on the ground at Kabul airport, but the remaining members of the Indian staff and contingent were unable, since the route, as you can see over there, was completely closed. These satellite images indicate that mobs were present. There were many cars. There was an overnight conversation between the US Secretary of State and the Indian Foreign Minister, Mr. Jaishankar. That is likely to have helped movement of the remaining Indian personnel to the airport today, but they were accompanied by the Taliban.